I'm plugged into the adapter. Do I need to do something else? Technical problems. Yeah. I don't usually have any issues. There, maybe that picked it up. Maybe?
Yeah.
What's that? Still doesn't.
Hard restart, reboot.
Okay. That's right. Sometimes that helps. Still doesn't seem like. Maybe? Yeah, no audio. Yeah, no audio. All right, we'll get rolling. So we're a little bit late. We'll see if we can make up some ground. For those of you who were in last session, this is going to be a bit of whiplash. We're talking about nothing like the last session. One of the things, I'll do full disclosure. I'm a director with Mandiant, so I have a slightly different view on some of our reporting than perhaps the last speaker, which I'd be happy to discuss, but all good. What I do want to talk about, so most of my time is spent on the defense side, specifically responding to breaches and helping organizations that responded to breaches. Probably the coolest part of my job is I get to spend a lot of time working with organizations that have ended up on, say, the wrong side of the media, right? This has been an interesting year, I think, for those of us who consider ourselves security professionals, right? We're seeing breach after breach. I did some just quick checking on the latest stats yesterday. So far in 2014, 606 companies have publicly announced that they've been breached. I can tell you that for every company that announces they've been breached, there's a lot more that don't announce, right? And I don't mean that as FUD. That's just simple facts, right? But I kind of take that personally because I've worked in this industry for 20 years now, and that means that I'm not doing a very good job, frankly, right? If I'm still getting breached, what the heck? I mean, seriously, why in the world with all of this stuff, right? We've got a bazillion vendors, of which I work for one, that tell you they've got this awesome solution that's going to solve all of our problems. And yet, we've still got breach after breach after breach after breach, right? So there's a disconnect somewhere. So one of the things that I want to do is figure out why is that still occurring? Why are we still having all of these breaches? Well, one of the things I realized, and that hence the title of this talk here, Infosec in the 21st Century, I took a kind of step back, right? So I've got a CISSP, so that means I know about nifty things like confidentiality, integrity, and analysis, or the LaPadula information security model, and neat things like that were created back in the 70s. And there have been a couple changes, I think it's fair to say, since the 70s, right? One of the biggest standards we still use in information security is NIST 833. Do you know when NIST 833 was published? Anybody know? When was the last update to NIST 833? Any guesses? It was this century. 2005, close. 2001. 2001. So 13 years ago, that was state of the art. Well, at least it was government state of the art. May or may not be. And really, this is the root of the issue, because what happens is we've got all this, and I don't know about you, but I don't want to end up on Bloomberg like that. That's just a bad day. If those of you have, if you have any familiarity with what happened at Target, they cleaned house. They literally cleaned house. They fired pretty much everybody, which is unfortunate because, well, I certainly don't argue that as organizations where we've got privacy data, we've got credit card data, we obviously have some needs, some requirements to protect that and take due diligence. But come on, we're not, when the trucks that pick up all the money from the bank, right, get robbed, they're transporting somebody else's money. We're not crucifying them in the media, and they're not all getting fired, are they? And yet, that's what happens kind of in this industry. We make a mistake, and now we're looking for new employment. And there have been a lot of notable, breaches this year. I don't know about you, but what's the world coming to when I can't buy cowboy boots and safety? I mean, seriously, it's just not the right kind of place, right? So, joking aside, this is the root of the problem, in my opinion. What most of us are doing as organizations, and I've spent most of my time on the practitioner side. So this isn't Tim speaking as a vendor here. This is Tim speaking as a longtime information security practitioner, right? What we do is we fall trapped to this vendor hype, right? And I freely admit I work for one of those vendors now, right? And it's not that tools are bad, but I think as engineers, we all like that cool, shiny tool, right? Oh, look at that new technology. That's going to slice, dice, and cook my food for me. But the bad guys now, whether they're from China, Russia, the US, wherever these bad guys come from, they've made some realizations that most of us haven't yet made. So step back for a second. Think about what all of these tools really do. So we've got firewalls, we've got IDS, IPS, we've got content filtering, we've got DLP, we've got a bazillion, right, different technologies to protect us. And what most of those technologies, if you boil it all back, are doing two things. They're either looking for malicious software or they're looking for exploits. And so a bunch of smart people that are the criminal type, of the discussion last time, realized if they just minimize their use of malware and their use of exploits, as simple as that, they walk around all our defenses, right? If you look at some of the groups like the Chinese, they're successful not because they're using a ton of exploits, they're exploiting our users, right? They send the spearfish, user clicks on it, agrees to run whatever that they're presented with, and happily installs the stuff, right? It's a completely different model. Couple that with most folks don't really, I think, maybe are a little out of touch with how these attacks play out. And I'll come back to that in a second. So how do we fix that? Because that's really what I'm hoping to communicate here this morning. And I would suggest we've got to flip that model to a much more visibility-based model. Now, this is one attacker lifecycle in particular. So this is the kind of the chain that a sequence of events that I would say the moderately skilled bad guys up tend to use, okay? So of course they've got to have some sort of an initial compromise, whether that's getting our users to click on a link and run something, whatever it is, so that they can get that foothold in our environment. There's no magic way for bad guy X to be in our environment without us letting them in the first place. But here's the thing. No matter how much user education we do, you're going to have some users that do it. I used to work for General Electric, helped run one of the CERT teams there, and at GE we had every employee got phished every 6 months, right? And of course, if you clicked on it, it'd take you to this education page, show you that, oh, this is what you did wrong, this is what you were looking for. First time they ran it, it was like, I don't know, 60-some% of people clicked on it. It was a lot of people. So I should also add, across General Electric, we're talking about 600,000 employees between full-time contractors and employees. Okay? So 60-some% of 600,000, a couple people willing to click on stuff. Steadily improved, right? Every 6 months got better and better till they hit about 86%, and then it just basically plateaued. So of course we dig into it. You know, what in the world's going on here? Why are our users not, you know, it looks kind of interesting to stand by the Tyrannosaurus there. Sorry, I digress. The 14% of 600,000 is what, 42,000? Bunch of people. Either way you cut it, right? So about half of them, right, we dig into that, about half of those are new employees, haven't been through the cycle. Okay, that makes sense. The other 7%, the other half of that 14%, and I'm using round numbers obviously, basically didn't give a damn. Seriously, they had clicked on every single one that they had ever been sent. And so you reached out to them and talked to them, and you get responses like, well, this is a waste of my time. I can't believe you're bothering me with this stuff. I've got real work to do, right? Or completely oblivious, or, you know, maybe they were in marketing and they're used to clicking on every link. You know, it just, reasons varied, to be clear, but in non-technical terms, I'd say it really just boiled down to they didn't give a damn. Well, 7% of 600,000 people is still a pretty big number, right? So education's good. Those things are good. But if we're relying on that to prevent us from ending up on the Bloomberg cover page, probably not going to work out so well for you, I would suggest. It's not like any of those organizations. I had the pleasure of working with a lot of the groups at a lot of those organizations that unfortunately made that list, right? They're all smart people, just like those of us here. They're all, competent. They're all really good at what they do, and yet they were pwned. And that's why I'm suggesting we've got to flip this, because our protections today are going to, the tools we've got that we're dropping in are going to do a pretty good job at maybe detecting some of this initial compromise, maybe even some of this foot-holding stuff. But then once we start moving into this middle ground where they're escalating privileges, they're now moving around laterally inside of our environment to find whatever it is they're looking for, whether it's credit cards or intellectual property, etc., we go dark. Why do we go dark? Because our visibility is mostly on the edges of our networks and the juicy bits, the servers, the stuff like that. But think about where our data resides today. It's everywhere. It's in the entire organization. Even if I've got my stuff protected on these servers in the middle, I'm pulling it down to my local workstation so I can edit it in Word or Excel or engineering application X, right? Which means the data is sitting there too, okay? And so the bad guys that are getting successful at this, all of them have simply realized they've just got to play in that middle space, because that's where we're completely unknown. So let me give you a specific example. So this is from a real breach. Obviously, I can't say who. This is a pretty minor one, right? This was only about $2.5 million worth of data, fairly small size organization. But this is kind of how it played out. So the 0 there, so the laptop kind of image with the host 0, that was the user that clicked on the spearfish. And then I've got some icons that I threw on there, right? So the BD octagon is the back door. So they installed a piece of malware there. They also downloaded a bunch of their tools. That's the diamond with the T. Okay, so they downloaded that onto host 0. That was the user who clicked on the spearfish. They dumped the passwords from the local cache, which I hope you realize that's all stored in clear text. That's actually not clear text, but reversible encryption rather. Right? That's not NTLM, so you don't have to crack it, which is really darn convenient. They then dump the sessions from host 0 to see, okay, what is the user from host 0 logging into in the environment? They use the credentials that they dumped from host 0 on those hosts, because of course that's what the passwords are for, right? Access those hosts and continued, rinse and repeat. Dump the local credentials, use those on the hosts that those are. And this is obviously simplified. All told, through that process, they ended up logging in with stolen credentials to 47 different hosts in that particular environment. Okay? Only 5 of those 47 hosts had malware of any kind on them. Only 5 of the 47. And there were only 10 of the hosts that had any tools whatsoever on them that weren't just built in to native Windows, which these were all breaches of Windows in this case. Okay? But yet they compromised 1,734 accounts. So they had the user IDs and passwords for those, right? And stole 910 documents, which the organization valued at $2.5 million. Not counting how much they had to pay, organizations to clean up the mess, investigate, so on and so forth, right? And this is a simple breach, but this overall process of dump those local credentials, use them on the next hop, right? I think we fall prey of, we go to great SANS training, right? Great stuff. But we go to the SANS training, for instance, for, say, pen testing, which is excellent. I'm not knocking it at all. But it's easy, I think, for us to fall into this trap of thinking, oh, since that's how we've been trained to do it, that's how the bad guys do it. That is not the case. You do not want to think that. Okay? For instance, bad guys want to map a network. Windows Active Directory rules. Okay? It just rules because I can use like dsquery and dsget to dump everything. Now I do need some sort of domain, but do you think I'm not going to get that somewhere in one of those hosts when I just rinse? That's their goal, by the way. They're just rinsing and repeating till they find a host. Okay, cool. Everybody's got to earn a living, I guess. So they get the domain credentials, which most often come from our help desk, I might add, right? Because we give our help desk folks domain credentials because they got to be able to log into our local hosts so they can help fix our printer problems, right? But that caches those domain credentials on that local host when it's done, and now the bad guys can leverage those to go wherever they want, dump the domain controller, so on and so forth, right? So I want a list of users in the environment. How do I do that? Net group, quote, domain users, quote, /domain. Do you know what credentials I need to do that? Computer's got to be a member of the domain. I don't even need local admin. I got to get to a command prompt, right? Let's say I want something a little juicier. Give me a list of all the computers. Oh, no, give me a list of all the domain controllers, all the domain admin accounts. All of that, you don't believe me, try it. Take your computer, back at the office, join to the domain, open up a command prompt, type net group, quote, domain space admins, quote, /group. You'll get a list of all the admin accounts in your Active Directory tree. I don't need Nmap. Why in the world should I use Nmap when Active Directory gives me everything I need? Oh, when it's built into Windows, which isn't going to set off any alarms anywhere. Do you see the problem? So these guys that are kind of at that mid-level and up have realized that we don't need to use exploits. We don't need to use a ton of malware. Oh, and if we don't, we can move around at will, completely oblivious. These groups that are in doing this, when we do the investigations and run them to ground, it's common for them to have been there for months or years, right? Just moving around, finding what they're looking for, getting it, moving it out. So how do we do that? So, again, we don't have a ton of time today, so this in and of itself can be an exhaustive talk, topic, right? We could spend days on how do we map to this visit. What I'm saying here is, how do we see things like that middle section, which is where they're spending most of their time, these bad guys that are going undetected in our environments? And that's by focusing on the activities rather than the malware. See, because the bad guys have needs just like we do. If they're going to be successful stealing whatever they're stealing or doing whatever damage they're going to do or etc., they have to have certain things. They've got to be able to get that foothold. They've got to be able to move around laterally in our environment. They've got to be able to find whatever it is that they're looking for and then get it out of our environments. And the current models are not helping us see that. That's the root of the issue here, right? So if we focus on the activities rather than the malware directly, it doesn't matter if they've got a new backdoor. It doesn't matter if they've got some new cool tool, because we can find them anyway. So what do? Well, all of their different activities, just like everything else, leave traces in the environment. So a lot of these guys will use things like the command line right, to schedule tasks. So host whatever, run this, right? Maybe they puts their tool there, their backdoor here. Well, that creates an @1 job. Do you really think a lot of users in your environment are using the command to schedule jobs? It becomes something that's really easy to look for as an activity type that we can go out hunting, right? Go out and find in our environment, which allows us to then dig deeper and say, hey, what's going on here? Maybe I've got a savvy user that's using, running @job doesn't mean I'm malicious. It doesn't. But if we understand some of these, right? Or those net group commands that I just mentioned, right? Those are going to throw event IDs 5665 or 4661, depending on if I'm, 2003 and down or Vista and up. Or pwdump. Pwdump is still used today. It's a hugely useful tool. And most folks think, oh, well, our AV stops that. No, not so much. What most AV does by default is classifies pwdump as a potentially unwanted software. And so we see it, right? So you're sitting there, you've got all these alerts flying in your SIM or whatever it is you're using for your central console, and you see, oh, pwdump, oh, that was Bob running a security test. And we just saw a critical clue, but we write it off, which is easy to do, right? That's, if you look at a situation like the Target, but I would argue any of those cases, the small signs were there. The challenge is we're not putting them together in the context because we're so busy care and feeding of all of these magical tools that are going to solve the world hunger for us. Again, pwdump. Whitelisting, I'm not personally a big fan of whitelisting as a prevention mechanism, the bit 9 and stuff like that, only because I just am not a big believer in having to spend hours going through continually updating all the legitimate software. If your enterprise is more than, say, 10 computers, then you're going to be spending a little bit of time care and feeding to whitelist and allow all of the software. But as a detection tool, it rocks, right? We're looking for these sorts of things. Oh, there you go. Here's all of that sort of stuff. Lots and lots of non-traditional sources like our DNS data, the actual event logs from our workstations in our environments. You can really get creative with a lot of this stuff and turn on some cool things. I'd recommend if you haven't looked at the capabilities of, for instance, the SysInternals tools, Recently, right, Rasinovich and crew are updating those things continually. And so we get familiar with these tools and we just kind of stop looking at, okay, what did they add new? They've added some crazy capabilities in the last year to some of those that have phenomenal capabilities to be a cheap man's, we don't have budget to run vendor X's amazing silver bullet solution. We don't need to, right? Sysmon, some of those things can do some really wicked things for helping us detect malicious activity in our environment. So what I would suggest is it really boils down to here. So a lot of what I spend time with organizations helping them, we're talking about, well, what does maturity look like? What are the groups that aren't ending up in the headlines doing that the rest of us aren't doing so that we end up in the headlines? And this is kind of where I've ended up kind of rating scale-wise. So it's kind of small to read here. At that very left-hand side, we've got reactive. Probably nobody here is in that category for their security team, where all you do is just react to whatever comes up. I hope not. The next group is where we find, I see, most organizations stopping, and that's tools-based, where we buy all of these tools, we drop them in, and then, we're good. Tools are done. I would add, by the way, this has this maturity has nothing to do with the size of the organization. I've seen a lot of small companies and small security teams that I would put very high in the maturity, whereas some, say, Fortune 5 companies, potentially, that are not, right? I had a conversation with a CISO not too long ago. He was briefing his new CISO, and he told the new CISO that there were no security problems in their organization. No security problems in their organization. Okay, cool. I would suggest that if you aren't seeing breaches, then that means you've got a visibility problem, not that you don't have malicious activity. One of the fun things that my team has gotten to do a lot is we do basically equivalent of compromise assessments, right? So we'll spend 2 weeks or a month with an organization hunting, right? We just go out, we start digging into their environment to see what's going on here. 100% of the time we find malicious activity that is going undetected. 100% of the time. That's not FUD, it is what it is, because we get relying on our tools, and the tools are telling us we've got nothing going on, so we've got nothing going on. We're good. It's a visibility issue. It's not a lack of malicious activity, right? So then we go up kind of to the next layer up from that, from the visibility, and we get a lot of folks there too, and that's what I would call your integrated, or what I call it as the integrated security team. So now we're using stuff like SIM effectively. We're not just feeding it logs, but we're actually using those logs to correlate activity across devices, amongst, right? So we've now get that security isn't a bunch of vertical pieces just dropped into place, but it's the totality of bringing that technology, those processes, the people together. And that's not a bad place to be. But you'll notice I've got some skulls over there on the right. The reason I've got those skulls is because at that level, what you're going to be able to deal with is kind of that level of attacker. So at the low end of attacker, we've got the kind of commodity actors, right? That's the guys, mostly out of former Soviet bloc countries, that are generating a ton of malware, but they're just not just there, to be clear. Generate malware, shove it out, shoot, let it run its thing, do its thing. They're mostly looking to monetize our assets. They really want our computers, is what those guys want. So we can handle them well, pretty well, up through if we're integrated. But there's a level of attacker above that, which is the types of guys that are hitting the Targets, the Chase Banks, the Home Depots, that are much more capable. I still wouldn't necessarily call them sophisticated. You know, I use sophisticated. They're at least smart enough to understand how to get around our tools, how most of our environments work, and that by using things like, you know, not using malware and stuff like that, that they can avoid, right? So in order to deal with them, though, we've kind of got to rise up to what I like to call the, you know, dynamic defense kind of level of maturity. So there, you're starting to understand that tools and the technology are a useful piece of the puzzle, but it's ultimately about the skills and coordination of the team, okay? If I've got a security organization and I'm asked to coordinate that, I've got typically two choices. Great tools, mediocre skill set. Great skill set, mediocre tools. I'll take great skill set 100 times out of 100. Because people that with a great skill set in dealing with this sort of stuff, where you're being innovative and you understand that not all of the activity relies on you know, just getting protection from my antivirus. If I know that I can get a lot of value out of the router sinkholes and places like that, and I start mapping that across to some of my other data, then I've got the ability to now start finding these guys who aren't using a bunch of malware. And that's where we've got to get to if we're going to be able to deal with those sorts of attackers. Then at the top end, what I would call resilient, right? Organizations that you've got to have, one, buy-in from the top. The organization's executive team needs to understand that security is not just a cost on the, you know, balance sheet. That security is an integral part of the overall organization. And the security team itself, then, this is where you start seeing groups that have metrics about what they're doing, right? Things like dwell time. So dwell time, for instance, would be bad guys breached here at such and such date. We found them at such and such date and time. So they had a dwell time of 6 months, 2 weeks, 4 days, so many hours. And when we start having enough capability in our security organization that we can, one, figure that out as well as track it, there's not a CEO on the planet that can't get the concept of dwell time. If I go to that CEO and I say, all right, when we started last year, our dwell time was 6 months, whatever. Now we've gotten our average dwell time down to 2 days. That's a meaningful way of illustrating how we just improved our detection capabilities, right? And then from the time we detect them, how long did it take us to get that host contained? How long did it take us to get that host remediated? Those are not complex metrics, folks. Those are metrics that we can use to explain to the business what the value of all of our efforts and the money that they're dumping in are, right? That's where we reach resiliency. We put those back in so that we can turn this around and our employees understand that we're not the group that's just trying to lock stuff down and prevent them from getting their work done, but we're the group that's trying to enable them to be able to get their work done and keep their jobs because we didn't have a breach and had serious financial, right? And that's ultimately what I would suggest that we've got to do as organizations is we've got to take a good hard look. It's the 21st century now, right? The bad guys that are it's really simple in my opinion. We've got all of these breaches still occurring even though we've been doing information security for a long time. Shame on us, right? It's time for us to start stepping up to the plate. And on the maturity stuff, even if you're not a targeted nation state, which you might find differently, but even if you're not, I would still argue you want that level of maturity in order to be able to deal with the threats that are. Because what I'm willing to guarantee you is that when you increase that visibility, stop just focusing on what the vendor tools are giving you, take a step back and really looking at it from that perspective of, the life cycle of the attacker. And to be clear, this is just one attack life cycle, right? This isn't the attack life cycle that, they used to pop Jennifer Lawrence's iPhone account, for instance, right? That's a different model. There's different types of bad guys with different life cycles. I can tell you this is the life cycle, though, that the bad guys are doing that are, making the bulk of that list, right? The ones that you're reading about in the media. And so I would suggest that, it's incumbent upon us as information security professionals to really step up to the plate and take this kind of seriously, not from a FUD perspective, but what's really happening in your organization. What happens when you start looking at all the DNS queries that are going out? You know what? Let's examine all the user agents in our outbound proxy. If you start looking at that data, you will find a lot of malicious activity that none of your magical vendor solutions are doing a thing about. Those are all valuable to you as an organization. That's right. And as my good friend Al here is hinting, it's very important to protect the corporate jewels. We could explain that reference later. But we've got a cool job, I would suggest. Who else gets to play in everybody's sandboxes like we do, right? If we're doing security right, we're talking to all of the different groups, the different people, the different technologies, etc. We got the coolest job in the world, in my opinion, because we get to play in everybody's sandbox, and we're allowed to, right? But if we keep allowing this to happen because we're using models of information security from the 70s, then at some point, some of these groups are going to wise up and go, hey, you suck, right? It's time to up our game. Hey, so I took that a little quicker, try and catch up a little bit of time. Questions? Do we have a microphone for questions? I can try and repeat. Any questions about that? Sir? Yeah. Sure. So Sysmon is one of the primary ones. That's why I mentioned that one, to be clear. I use a lot of the others. I find a lot of the other SysInternals tools, though, useful as part of the less the active detection. What's cool about Sysmon now, if you haven't looked at it lately, is it can log for you in the Windows event log every time somebody executes and every time there's a network socket, which is phenomenally useful, right? Bring those event logs back, start looking through that. You're going to find all sorts of interesting stuff that shouldn't be happening in your environment, I promise. So Sysmon's the easy one, but all of the other ones like the Procmon, etc. So let's think about it from the perspective of the bad guys. Let's even take the malware, right? Because they're definitely going to still use some malware. I'm going to tell you that the sophisticated attackers are going to use something custom, right, to target your organization. It's not hard to re-roll, a backdoor, remote access Trojan, what have you, so that it's customized specifically to use against you, but that your AB is now not going to be able to detect. Well, that's got to run as a process or a service, some sort of thing in your... So what happens, for instance, if you just go across your organization and you use something like the SysInternals tools to say, give me a list of all of the services that are running on all my hosts. And stack those, right? Just stack them up and go, do a pivot table in Excel, something like that, right? And go, what are the services running in my organization? What's going to be interesting always are the low frequency and the high frequency stuff, right? Your organization should look like a bell curve, right? Because we all use standard gold images, they're typically called, right, to deploy all of our workstations, all of our laptops. So that means most of the hosts are running mostly the same thing, right? So now if we just take a simple look at what are all the services running, how many hosts focus on something like what's running 10 or less copies across my environment, for instance. You will find a lot of interesting stuff. And so with some simple, say, PowerShell scripting, maybe some Windows remoting, you can easily run stuff like that across your entire environment and gather a ton of interesting data and show you stuff that none of your tools are, they're basically completely oblivious of it. Sir? Oh, so his question was, yeah, so are some of these indicators showing up in the IOCs that go out there? The way that usually works, so the short answer is yes and no. So yes, in that the specific things that are being found, so let's say I run across those services, for instance, and I see a service that's malicious. I will potentially write an IOC and potentially share that. But where the no is I would suggest you can't rely on just that as a security practitioner because that's only getting you the known bad. What about all the unknown bad in your environment? That's where you have to go, we have to go looking for it. Where we have to go beyond our tools, right? So yes, the found stuff gets in the IOCs, but there's really no mechanism today still to easily write, say, an IOC that finds me lateral movement within my organization. I really need to tie that, right? I can look for things. So that's what, again, I simplified a lot of this just because, we only have 45 minutes here to chat today. But this is literally the tiny tip of the iceberg on what we can do. Think about if you're doing that. So if I take the credentials from one host, use that to log into the next host, and then dump the credentials from there and use that to log into the next host, those are going to show up as explicit logins. My authentication to the next host is going to be different than the host or the user ID I'm currently logged in as. That happens legitimately in our environment when we do run as and things like that. So I can't just say all of those explicit logins are bad. But if I instead go out and I say, show me all the explicit logins, now show them to me in sequential order, potentially becomes interesting, right? Because if I'm going from host 0 to host 1 to host 3 to host 4, I'm going to have sequential explicit logins. And so we're looking at the same sort of activity, but just through a new lens. So no easy way to do IOCs for that. That's on us. Another question over there, sir? Uh-huh. Sure. Okay. So are you asking how often we find? Yeah, sure. Okay. So ultimately depends on definitions. Okay? So we always find something interesting in every hole. Okay? But interesting might be misconfigured routers. It might be our firewall rules are misconfigured, and we've got, net BIOS traffic that's hitting the internet and is externally accessible. So you'll see a lot of that, okay? That's going to be your predominant, what you're going to find. I would say and again, it's also going to depend on the size of the enterprise, but let's say we'll just pick for straw man purposes an enterprise of, say, 2,500 endpoints. 2,500 endpoints, I would expect to find at least commodity stuff that is going undetected and is in the environment at least 50% of the time, probably 75% of the time, in terms of those individual piles of data. And some of them are richer than others, right? I've never not found true malicious activity looking at user agents, for instance. You start slicing user agents, you just find all sorts of interesting things. The serious malicious stuff, I would say probably 10% of the time. Yeah, 10% of the time. All right, so 5 till. We'll call it there. Again, tried to make up some time here. Thank you for your consideration here in attending this, and hope everybody continues to have a good con. Hey, Faye, how are you?